Hello and welcome everyone to the IURC North America launch of the Thematic cluster on education, jobs and skills with a focus on urban regeneration and innovation. It's a mouthful. My name is Trisha Hackett and I'm a senior advisor on sustainable urban development with the North America region. I've seen from the registration list that there are some from the Latin America region where you of the IURC program where you might recognize me, where I'm leading the city-to-city cooperation. And as you're arriving, before we go any further, just a couple of housekeeping things. So this first part of the session is going to be a presentation. The second part is going to be an open forum. And what would be great is if in the chat box, you could please write your name, your role, your city, maybe also your country, so that we know who's with us today. Also, we will be recording the first part of the session, which is the presentation. And for the second half of the session, which is an open forum and for discussion, we won't be recording that. So people can feel more free and relax. First off, before I go any further, it's my great pleasure to introduce Ana Guayarte, who's a program manager with the EU delegation in Canada, based in Ottawa, and she's going to offer you some words of welcome, and then I will take things from there. So the floor, the screen is yours, Ana.
Thank you very much, Tricia. Can you hear me well? Because my sound was kind of cutting off a little bit. Okay, good.
I hear you well.
Thank you very much. Well, thank you very much for this introduction, and welcome to all participants to this webinar supported by the International Urban and Regional Cooperation Program, the IURC. This program, as you know well, is one of the European Union commitments to the new urban agenda, and it will remain an important part of the overall EU actions in support of cities in addressing global challenges and such as sustainable urbanization and climate action. This program will continue to contribute to the delivery of the Sustainable Development Goals, the new urban agenda, the Paris Agreement, and it is also a central part of to implement the new EU priorities as the European Green Deal and of course the Recovery Initiative. IURC is now a global network which has at the moment like 140 cities and regions from 6 geographical areas. But the aim is to grow further during the implementation of this program. The areas that are part of this global program are the European Union, of course, China, Latin America, Australia, New Zealand, India, Japan, and North America with United States and Canada. In this regard, a key goal of the International Urban and Regional Cooperation Program is also the promotion of business opportunities and to create linkages between public and private sector. And that is, you will see today that we are really working on this. This is, as I said, the first webinar we are kicking off the webinars, but also the thematic clusters. Today is the kickoff of the thematic cluster dedicated to urban regeneration and innovation that is led by the city of Baltimore. The interest of the European Union through the clusters is twofold. First is to generate knowledge, to promote innovation, to understand from the experiences, your experiences that you are going to showcase today. What is the key for success? What is the right governance that helped you or that you think will help you to go through the desired change that you wish? The leadership, what is the right leadership, how to build the leaderships, what are the tips that you can share with the other cities. All this kind of interesting expertise that you have created and that you can share with all of us and that we can publish later on in our webpage. and the outcome papers that will be developed by the team and that will inspire other cities. And the second objective, which is very important, is of course to promote networking, to put together those leader cities, all of you, that are very active on the topic that is going to be discussed. Tricia will mention shortly again what are the topics we will be working in under the program. And we really want to support you because we need that you support us in our aim for a green, sustainable, and inclusive world. I want to thank very much to the City of Baltimore for accepting to lead this cluster. The rest of the cities that are participating also in the cluster and are here today with us, and to the Baltimore Development Corporation. I cannot really wait to hear and learn from you. Thank you very much. Tricia, back to you.
Great, thank you. Thank you so much, Anna, for sharing the importance of the IURC program to the European Commission, the European Union, and importantly, the role that the program plays in delivering on the important agenda, the Green Deal, the EU Urban Agenda, the global agenda, SDGs. As some of you in the audience knows, I was involved in the first phase of the program as well. And I think of this program as a kind of on the ground practical expression of the values and policies of the EU, of not only making a more sustainable, smarter Europe, but making a sustainable, smarter world. So it's very inspirational. So we go from kind of the high level now to progressively getting more focused and more closer to the ground, we'll say. So if we could go to the next slide, I'm just going to give a brief overview of the structure of the session today. So again, I know some of you have joined maybe after my initial introduction, but just to say this is a kickoff. So this is really the first, and it's very exciting because, you know, the terms of reference come out years ago, and then we go through lots and lots of planning and this application selection process, the launch events, and then this is really the first working event, let's say, working together in this cluster. So we'll be learning from this session, and we'll be asking for your feedback at the end to tell us how we can do it better. But again, thanks so much for joining us here. So we'll have first is a presentation by well, I'll introduce Colin later, but a presentation and an inspirational case for around 20 minutes or so, and then we have a question and discussion. So please, those of you who are in the audience, listen intently to Colin. It's going to be very interesting, and we want to have an interactive discussion, and I'm sure there'll be components of what Colin, I mean, very much what he'll be presenting about is prompted through this pandemic and emergency, which has affected the whole world. So I imagine there'll be parts that might be interesting for you in the audience to transfer or replicate in your own city. So sometimes these sessions are just one presentation after the other. So we wanted to make sure that there was time for actually discussion with the speaker. We're very lucky to have Colin with us today. And then moving into the next part of the day is an open forum, and that's where we are going to ask one representative from each of the cities who are here. So in the audience, we have current IURC cities, we have the wider part of the IURC family, which are the participants from the last phase who, you know, are still active in this phase, and some close stakeholders. So for that session, we would like for you, as this is a kickoff, and we'll be having between 4 and 6 sessions over the next 2 years. This is the opportunity in that session to as the program developed for this phase, we heard the interest from the cities in working in a more multilateral way. So this component of clustering cities, of having multi-pairings, of having thematic networks, is a reflection of that desire that we heard from the first phase for the cities. So we would like for you to share with us, because the topics are very broad across the theme. So actually, could you go to the next slide? I'll say, please, Darlene. So in an effort to, it's hard because obviously these are, they're big topics. So the overview of the overall program is sustainable urban development, and then thinking of how the cities could work together in different clusters. We in the North American region are working in 3 different clusters. So this is education, jobs, and skills, and this is the kickoff. We'll be having so some cities will be in more than one cluster, some cities might be just in one cluster. So renovation wave, energy efficiency in buildings, sustainable urban development, mobility, and transport. And obviously we recognize that these are transversal issues and there's crossover. For example, we're talking about education, jobs, and skills, but very much through a lens of urban regeneration and innovation. So the goal of these groups is that they're smallish, peer-to-peer working groups. It's networking, capacity building, knowledge sharing. So your cities will have the opportunity to hear from other cities, to hear from your peers, and then also, you have, and this is what we saw happen in the first phase, that cities were reaching out directly with their peers and saying, this is really interesting what you're doing, and this is really relevant for us. So, could we hear more about that? And we know the spirit of the IUC, the cities participating in the program is one of openness and sharing, and so that's the philosophy behind where we are today. And so that second part of the session is for you to tell us a bit about your challenges, problems. Maybe you have an interesting project or pilot related to the topic of the thematic cluster, which in this case is education, jobs, and skills, with the lens or focus on urban regeneration and innovation. We know it's ambitious, but we also know that it's possible. So, so please, as Colin is speaking, think about questions that you might have for him, but also think about, we'll ask one representative from each city to give a brief, just tell us, not a presentation, that sounds a bit too grand, but to just tell us about why you're here today, why this is interesting, why this is relevant for your city, and that will help us tailor future presentations as well. So without further ado, I am delighted to introduce our keynote speaker. Colin Tarbert is the president and CEO of the Baltimore Development Corporation, the BDC, which serves as the economic development agency for Baltimore City. It's responsible for growing the city by retaining and attracting businesses, expanding job opportunities for city residents, and increasing investment in city neighborhoods. And he'll tell you a lot more about that. Colin originally trained as an architect and has served in various leadership roles for nearly a decade in the mayor's office of Baltimore City during 3 administrations, including the role of Deputy Chief of Strategic Alliances, Deputy Major for Economic and Neighborhood Development. Colin has accepted on behalf of the City of Baltimore and the BDC to be the city leader for this thematic cluster, and will be delivering a series of presentations on relevant programs, pilots, and initiatives in Baltimore that we're sure will be of interest and inspiration to other IURC cities. I had the very good fortune of working closely with Colin and his colleagues in the City of Baltimore in the first phase of the program, when Baltimore and Turin, Italy were collaborating together on topics that included social innovation, neighborhood regeneration, reuse of vacant properties, and attracting and retaining startups and venture capital. Through the program, both cities established a robust international cooperation to strengthen their respective social innovation economies. And I looked quickly in the audience that we have Erica Alborella from Turin joining us today. So maybe in the open forum later, she might want to say a little bit about what that cooperation meant for Torino. Baltimore City, through the Baltimore Development Corporation, entered into a formal partnership with the City of Turin through the Torino City Lab to promote social innovation in both cities. The goal was to reinforce channels between Turin and Baltimore of cross-fertilization in local innovation ecosystems and favor the acceleration growth of innovative business and operating. Another result of Baltimore's participation in the program was a Baltimore-based property developer making an investment in an innovative social or public housing provider called Homes for All in Torino. And we look forward to seeing how that partnership unfolds in the future. So I think I wanted to mention that because especially for new cities who are new and city parents who are new to the program, I think Baltimore and Turin are a real success story for us in many ways. It could go on and on, but this is about something else today. But just as a point of inspiration, and lastly, we were actually planning a wonderful event that we were all looking forward to in Baltimore in the spring of 2020. So you know what happened with that. It was in collaboration with the New Growth Innovation Network on inclusive economic development, inviting a large cohort of IURC cities to attend. And of course, that event had to be canceled. So, almost 19 months later, I guess, here we are. And I'm really delighted in this new phase of the program. We have Baltimore back with us again. And I'm really confident that Colin has, really interesting and relevant stories, projects, and plans to share with us, not only today, but over the course of this implementation of this thematic cluster. So with that long introduction, I'm handing it over to you, Colin. Thank you so much.
Great. Thank you so much, Tricia, and hello, everyone. I am really excited and honored to be able to kick off today's IURC program for North America. As Tricia said, Baltimore had the pleasure of participating in the first phase with our friends in Torino, Italy. So ciao, Erica. And it's exciting to see all of the new cities participating in this phase. I know we have friends just down the road in Northern Virginia, so I'm sure some of this will resonate with you. So as Tricia said, we're pleased to be the thematic cluster lead. I'm hoping to learn as much from you as hopefully you can glean from what we're working on here in Baltimore. And by no means have we solved our issues. So this is really meant to be a conversation as well. And as Tricia said, we'll be working with you throughout the program. And so today is really just to give everyone an overview of a strategic plan that we've recently, or really will recently roll out. We'll roll it out officially like next week or this week, and we'll make sure everyone has the link. We've been at this for about 2 years. And then what we'll do is a deeper dive into initiatives or programs that are part of the strategic plan where hopefully we can all share best practices. So I'm starting with a photo of our city. That seems to be the way that we start most of these presentations, just so you can get a flavor of what Baltimore is. So we're a modern city on the waterfront, but with a mix of historic architecture and lots of neighborhoods. So I just wanted to show you a picture of our inner harbor and our skyline. And then I have to figure out how to go to the next slide. There we go. So you've already been introduced to the IURC, and you've been introduced to me. As Tricia said, I lead the Baltimore Development Corporation. We serve as the city's economic development agency. We're a quasi-agency, so we're nonprofit, but also funded through city government primarily. And today I'm going to talk primarily about Baltimore Together, a platform for inclusive prosperity, and what that is and what that means. Just to level set for our friends around the world, or at least in North America, Baltimore is located on the east coast of the United States. We're located just about 40 miles north of Washington, D.C., our country's capital, of course. And so that's up the road from Northern Virginia, who's participating, and just south of Philadelphia. As I mentioned, we are what we would call a historic city in America. I know many of the European cities are much older, but we were established in 1797. We have a mayor and city council form of government. It's very driven by the mayor. Our Our population is just under 600,000, and we are a majority Black city. About 60% of our residents are African American, 28% are white. We have a growing Hispanic population as well as a growing Asian population, which folds into our strategic plan. We also have seen a shift in our population from with a more younger, educated, and wealthier residents moving in, empty nesters moving in, meaning folks that are retired, older. We've seen a decline in our Black middle class, and we've seen an overall decline in our population, but an increase in our household. And the reason for that is the household size are getting smaller, so it's mainly singles or couples moving in as opposed to large families. In terms of our major industries, and we'll touch on some of these as we go through our strategic plan, we have EDS and MEDS, as we call them. So those are our hospitals and colleges and universities. We have 13 colleges and universities in the city proper. We have a fairly robust life sciences sector. We have 2 bioparks that are anchored by Johns Hopkins and University of Maryland, with a lot of research and development happening. We're also a tourist destination. We have a fairly significant convention industry, as well as seasonal tourism. We are a port city, so the Port of Baltimore is a significant player in the overall logistics and supply chain, and we've been very busy throughout the pandemic. And then as related to that is we are growing significantly, although we always have been a hub for logistics and warehousing. And then in addition, we are also seeing a growth in our creative class, as well as what we call social innovation, which is one of the topics that Baltimore and Torino worked on together. So the primary focus of my presentation today is around Baltimore Together. For the US cities, you may have what is called a CEDS. This is a comprehensive economic development strategy. For US jurisdictions, we're required to have a CEDS document in place in order to access federal funding. And right now, both with the pandemic as well as some of the recent measures in Congress, there's a significant amount of public funding being made available to cities. And so this document and this initiative, Baltimore Together, is very important for the city of Baltimore and to be able to access those funds. That's one piece of this. The other piece of Baltimore Together is really twofold. One, and I'll talk a little bit about the timeline. We started this before COVID, and we were actually going to have the convening that Tricia mentioned here to talk about what we were setting out to do. This was 2 years ago. It was really to set a new vision and a new pathway for Baltimore in terms of a more equitable and sustainable economy. And I'll give some of the background as to why we were moving in that direction. And then as we went through the pandemic, the Baltimore Together initiative also became what we would call a recovery plan. So it was both a equitable growth plan, and then became and is a recovery plan in terms of restoring our economy post-COVID. So I mentioned this, we actually started this 2 years ago. It's been a long journey for us, but I think we're excited to reach the milestone that we've reached. We had a whole series of meetings. Lots of folks were involved. We transitioned through a new mayoral administration during this time. We've obviously went through COVID, so it's just a very complicated time to lead this type of initiative. But the folks that we engaged stuck with us throughout the process, and the new administration, the new mayor Brandon Scott, embraced what we were doing. And so we're now arriving at the point where we've completed all of our public comment, and we are issuing what we'll call the final report this week or next week. But that's not necessarily the end of the process. That's really kind of the beginning of implementing a lot of the ideas here. So to kick off with our vision, I want to talk a little bit about what we did differently, and maybe some cities have a master plan or a strategic plan around economic development. And so our vision here is not the same vision statement that we've had in the past. And the big difference here is that we were really focusing on racial equity. For the colleagues in the US, not only did we go through a pandemic over the last year, but we really went through what some would call a racial reckoning after the murder of George Floyd. And there was a lot of civil discussion and unrest and political debates around racial equity in America generally, and in particular cities. And so a city like Baltimore, which is majority African American, this was very important. We had already started on this journey before that. And so when the murder of George Floyd happened and the discussions across the US happened, it really just gave more importance to the work that we were doing, and kind of compelled us to continue moving in the direction that we were. So this vision statement about Baltimore and our economy focuses on diversity and inclusion. It focuses on lifting up historically excluded Baltimoreans, which I'll sort of get at in some of the statistics. It focuses on what we call redlining in Baltimore, which were areas of the city that were African American, that were literally redlined on a map, and lending was not permitted in those areas. It was deemed too risky. And so when you look at West Baltimore and East Baltimore in particular, they're still significantly disinvested from those racist policies of the past. And then in the last piece here, we call out sort of the future and the goal of really investing in people of color, and not just in, mom and pop type restaurants and, stores and retail, but really in high growth sectors. So life sciences, technology. And the goal there is to really build generational wealth in Baltimore's communities of color. And like I said, this is a very different direction than our traditional economic development plans, which have centered more just around job growth and population growth. Before I touch on the key findings of the report that drove the discussion, I did want to talk a couple of things that we did differently. I've already mentioned the keen focus on racial equity. We also made a concerted effort to engage a lot more people in this process and different people in this process. So we had over 300 people involved in roughly 30 or 40 different meetings, more than a dozen different working groups, all convened. And so that allowed us to include younger social innovators. It allowed us to include more residents. It allowed us to include more community members, faith-based leaders, to really have a better sense of what the issues were, not just from an economic development standpoint, but from a social and community standpoint. We also committed to accountability. So a lot of times when plans are put together, the question is, well, what happens afterwards? And so we've committed to reporting out annually, if not more often. And we've created a website where we will be putting up very specific metrics that I'll talk about. And we also modeled this on other cities that have been successful. In particular, Propel LA was one model that we looked at. And so I say that because as we gather today, the more that we can learn from each other and borrow, the better. And we reached out to LA County, and they were very gracious with their time and sharing their best practices, what went right, what went wrong with us. So when we started the report 2 years ago, there were sort of 6 key findings which drove the results of this. One, our economy was growing at a competitive pace, which was good news. 2, our city's population, as I mentioned, was becoming more educated and more wealthy, which we viewed as positive. 3, our population was still going down, but we were seeing this increase in households. So it was a little bit of a mixed bag, but generally positive. And then there were 3 sort of, not so positive ones, 2 of which I don't think were surprises. The last two here, one, that racial disparities were wide. We knew that. There's a huge gap between income and employment between Black and white residents. There's also a very large gap between minority-owned businesses, which we have a significant amount of, but the amount of revenue share is only 12% of the total base, and the minority ownership accounts for about half. And so what that means is that minority businesses are not growing their revenue or their profit nearly as much as non-minority or white-owned businesses. The piece that was surprising to us, and which is a focus of the plan, is around job growth. And what we saw was that job growth in businesses that were small, and the definition of that being under 500 people, was basically flat or non-existent. And the job growth was significant and largely dependent on large companies and anchor institutions above 500 people. And so as the pandemic played out, we were able to really learn a lot more about our small businesses in Baltimore and the resources that they needed to survive. So after 2 years of discussion and work groups, we came up with 7 big picture goals. And so these are the goals that are really going to drive our vision over the next 5 years. This is a 5-year plan. So one is build an equitable economy. And what we mean by that is to really eliminate the economic racial disparities. And on the next slide, I'll talk about how we're going to track that. The second one is to be a world-class leader in key industry sectors. I mentioned a few of those already: life sciences, logistics, digital services, medical devices, social enterprise, and creative industry. That's where Baltimore seems to have a real niche, and we want to focus on growing those industries here. Third is to build a thriving innovation and small business ecosystem. So both the high growth, high scaled companies in terms of entrepreneurship, as well as helping our small businesses expand and grow. Fourth is to work on our workforce system. We have a very fragmented workforce development system here with lots of different players. And so trying to better organize that is key to making sure our residents have career opportunities at a living wage. Fifth is to grow our population. So we're a city that wants to grow. We have room to grow, and we want to grow in an inclusive way. And then sixth is to support neighborhood development in a more equitable way. And so this is really investing in those formerly, as I said, redlined neighborhoods, which have seen considerable disinvestment over the decades. And then lastly, I think this is one that we all share, is to recover stronger from COVID. So that's really looking at some of our key industries that have been hit most impacted, most hard, being tourism, convention business, as you might imagine, but also our hospitals and healthcare systems have also taken a significant impact due to COVID. And I'm happy to share these slides. I wanted to share this one. This is what I've already talked about, but I didn't touch on the metrics. And so in part of the transparency and accountability that we've committed to the public and to our stakeholders is to take each one of these goals and have a very simple metric for each one that we will report on over the next 5 years. And so we're in the process of creating our dashboard. And so we'll show whether or not we're moving in the right direction or not moving in the right direction. So I won't go through each one of these, but we found it to be very important to take what is a very high level goal and distill it down into something that people can see, and we can determine whether or not our strategies are achieving what we're trying to achieve. So then we also created 4 different strategies as part of the plan. And again, these are fairly high level and kind of weave throughout all of the different actions that we have. But the one thing that we heard over and over and over in our focus sessions with businesses, with communities, et cetera, was that we need to work together. There's a lot of different nonprofits. There's a lot of different economic development organizations in Baltimore. A lot of great efforts that are happening, but they're not happening in a way that we can leverage each other. So one of the goals here is to really break down the barriers and silos and foster a lot more collaboration. And that's beginning to happen through this process. The second strategy is to invest in both people and places. And so the people focus is really citywide, making sure that all residents have access to resources, whether it's career resources or job training. And then the places has to be a little bit more specific. We know we don't have enough funding to go through and invest in every area. And so we're trying to make strategic investments. 3, I already talked about. This is really building from strength. So looking at those key sectors that we want to focus on. And then the 4th one, compete to succeed, is sort of the opposite of number 3. That's really focusing on our deficiencies, public safety, schools, high taxes and fees, as well as a lack of public transportation. So as I said, we've completed this plan. We'll be releasing it. And so the next phases for us, and hopefully we get to do this journey together, is to seek funding to operationalize this. One of the things that we learned as a best practice was to put someone in charge of this plan. I lead the organization, so I have lots of different projects and initiatives, but really to have one singular person focused on implementation of the strategic plan. As I mentioned, we're working on our website to make sure that the information is easily available and transparent. We're going to continue the work group meetings. That's part of the work together strategy to drill down on some of the actions and outcomes. And then one of the big ideas that has come out of this is to do an annual summit where we can bring everyone together to talk about the plan, to talk about what people are working on, and let people collaborate in real time. And that was part of the goal that we were working on, as Tricia mentioned, 2 years ago before the pandemic. I know we're a little short on time. I think I started a little late. I did want to just take a moment with this slide, and we'll have more time as this program moves forward to talk about, you know, these overarching goals, which are fairly high level, and what they mean in terms of practicality and on the ground actions. And so over the next 2 months, we'll be launching a new program around small business assistance. And this will be one of the themes that Baltimore talks about. During the pandemic, our organization issued over $19 million to 1,500 small businesses, relatively small grants to assist them through COVID. The vast majority were minority-owned businesses or BIPOC, Black, Indigenous, people of color businesses. Most were women-owned businesses, and 2/3 were city resident-owned businesses. So we were trying to be very local and also very focused on business owners that are typically left out of economic recovery. The other thing that we did was we launched a collaborative technical assistance network. And so BDC partnered with 17 different partners, nonprofits, universities, grassroots organizations to help small businesses. So we've helped over 3,000 small businesses, and we've learned a lot about what they need in order to not just survive through pandemic, but also hopefully thrive and grow post-pandemic. And so phase 2 of this network, which has been well received, is underway. And so hopefully we'll have a little bit more time to talk about some of the strategies that we want to implement in order to get small businesses professional services that they need around accounting, around e-commerce, around marketing. A lot of the things that they end up having to do themselves, we're going to try to procure for them from other local small businesses so that everyone can hopefully grow together. So that's really my conclusion of Baltimore Together. Again, it's a sort of a large overview of what we're working on, and hopefully we can share more detail as we move forward. There is a website link here, which we can put in the chat, and I'll go ahead and stop, and we might have a few minutes for questions, but I'll defer to Tricia.
Thank you so much, Colin. And we have a relatively roomy agenda today, so you're just on time. So thank you so much for that presentation. And when we were preparing for this, we had talked yesterday about that it's a really interesting moment because you've done so much, so you had quite a lot to present and tell us about. But there's, you know, you're still early on in the process, and as this cluster, this cohort of cities, is going to take place over the next 2 years. You know, it'll be really interesting for us to see how things unfold, and for you to be able to share with us. I mean, I think we will share this presentation. There's also a great case study and a short video where you get to hear from other stakeholders in the process. We'll share all of those with participants. But I think, you know, the specific metrics that you have are so important, obviously. And I think that's what the learning for the other cities will be on, what's been easier to achieve with those metrics, what's been harder. And I know you're always very willing to share and be direct, let's say, about about your challenges. And I think when I read the case study, something that really struck me, it said that in order to lead to more equitable outcomes in the long run, especially for historically excluded Baltimoreans, the cities had to understand that what's also needed is an equitable process. And I think that really comes through very strongly, is that the process, the importance of the equity in the process as well as the outcome. We have a few minutes now for questions. I know that I've had the opportunity to read the case studies and see things before you. Some of you are just hearing it for the first time. But in this session, what we'd like to do is for it to be interactive. If there are questions from the audience, we'd ask you to ask, put your camera on and your microphone, obviously, and you can ask Colin directly any questions that you might have about the presentation of the Baltimore Together.
Thanks, it was a great presentation. I really enjoyed it. Since Baltimore is a very globally engaged city with a port, Maryland has, the state of Maryland, lots of statistics about investment, this global engagement. I wanted to ask whether the city of Baltimore tracks dollar flows from abroad and the jobs created as a result of investment from abroad just within the boundaries of the city of LA. So we're not talking about the state of Maryland and the nice graphs that they've got about dollar flows of foreign direct investment. I'm referring specifically to the city of Baltimore and how it tracks international engagement, so that a case can be made about the countries that are most invested in the city versus those that are least invested, as a means of maybe filtering and developing priorities. Because one of the challenges that I've observed for many, many years is that cities in the United States struggle to prioritize countries with which they work. And it seems that a helpful first filter is those countries that are invested. And then on the basis of those countries that are invested, which countries are also offering us policy and technical innovations? The Hollands to help us with climate mitigation, or Denmark with their renewable energy and wind, things like that. Thanks.
It's a great question. I think that the majority of the data in terms of international or FDI is probably at the state level, which is our Maryland Department of Commerce. I think for us that's aspirational. I would like to do more in the international sector. The one piece of business that we do, which actually extends beyond Baltimore City proper into surrounding county, is we operate the Foreign Trade Zone 74, which is, I won't get into the Foreign Trade Zone. So we do have a lot of statistics in terms of companies that are working both abroad and here. Most of that is related to the port. But we haven't really had the resources to go through and figure out, which countries are doing the most business in the city proper, which might lead us, as you've alluded to maybe more business development. I think it's a great idea, and it's part of the plan to develop a more strategic international business development strategy. So thank you so much.
Since you mentioned you working with LA to draw lessons, if I could just add just one follow-up. LA County, and Arlington has started to model this, but LA County, for a cost of under $20,000 and less than 150 man hours in partnership with Loyola Marymount and now USC, has put together a beautiful FDI report. It's come out for the last 2 years, and it's absolutely stunning. For the purposes of this conversation, there's more investment from Europe in LA County than there is of all of Asia. So it's phenomenal what comes out of this. And we're trying to start something like this in Northern Virginia. And be great to look, misery loves company. We'd love to have more people that are in this conundrum of trying to figure out how to prioritize join this conversation.
Yeah, I'd love to talk about that. I think it's a great idea. And for those who are on the call, we actually are the Greater Washington Partnership has the region. So from Baltimore down to Northern Virginia, there is a group that is helping us work together. And so Dale, maybe that group with us and you all could do that study, both for our own entities, but also for the region. I think it's a great idea.
Yeah, well, let's talk separately about that. I'll shut up. Thanks.
That connection is music to our ears. That's exactly what we hope gets generated in these sessions. So thank you for that great question and comments. I saw in the chat that we have Eston Bidel in the audience, and who asked a question. Eston, would you like to ask the question? Welcome to show yourself or just your voice.
Great. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Great. Yeah. So I have a bit less technical question, but first of all, thanks for the great presentation. You talked about population decline and also disinvestment with the history of redlining. I know that abandoned buildings are a big problem in Baltimore. I know just for, issues connected to public safety, but there's also like an incredible historical value to these buildings. So I was just wondering if your strategy has a specific approach to, how to deal with vacant properties.
We do. It is a problem, and it is concentrated in portions of the city, although it does sort of go citywide. So for the benefit of others, statistically, we have about 16,000 vacant buildings. Most of those are row homes, and most of those are actually privately owned vacants. And so over the last 10 years, I've been involved with different strategies to abate those. There's basically two ways. One is you renovate it, and the other is you knock it down. And so we use both of those strategies. We do have a number that are, historic in nature and historic to different neighborhoods. And so we move towards stabilization and renovation. And then in other areas, there's really no market and there's not very much historical integrity. And so we move towards demolition. So we've demolished probably 4,000 to 5,000 units since I've been working in city government over the last 10 plus years. We started with roughly 16,000 vacants, and you heard me say we have about 16,000 vacants. So that means that we would have had 20,000 vacants if we hadn't demolished the number that we did. So unfortunately, we're sort of stuck in this limbo. At the same time, we've cleared a lot of land and we've made a lot of progress. And so it's a both and approach. It's a very expensive issue that we have to deal with. The cost of we demoed everything today, which really isn't even possible from practical scenarios. It's about $1 billion. And it also includes a lot of complicated federal rules and regulations because you have to relocate people under the Uniform Relocation Act, which can cost you $150,000, which is very expensive. Cost you, $10,000 to knock it down. Cost you a lot more to move people if they're occupied.
Is that per person, Colin, or per household?
Yeah, if they're occupied, if it's owner occupied, it usually costs us about $200,000, and that's a federal sort of mandate. If they're renters, it's a little bit less, maybe $150,000. If it's vacant, we just knock it down. It costs us $10,000, and we lien the property, and we end up taking ownership of it. And so what we've tried to do is strategize on where we have whole block outcomes, where we can knock down the entire block, or where we can rehab the whole block. Renovations obviously take a lot more subsidy. So usually we're at about a $30,000 subsidy from the city or the state in order to make that property worth buying, because it's worth $30,000 less than it costs to construct it because the market is so weak. So we can do a whole presentation on our vacant housing problem here. It's fascinating. It's also very frustrating, as you might imagine, but we have some of the best practices in terms of vacant housing. It's all mapped. We know who all the owners are. It really is a financial issue in terms of the solution.
Great, thank you. I saw that Alyssa Muto from San Diego had her hand up. Alyssa, are you still there?
I'm still here. Yes.
Okay.
Yeah. Good morning, everybody.
Good morning.
And I guess afternoon, evening for others. Colin, what a fantastic plan and work that your city has done. And one thing I wanted to inquire a little bit more about was your work with community-based organizations. You'd mentioned you had connected with over 300 individuals. How did you use community-based organizations, and how did you go about supporting those organizations, contracting, et cetera, in this process?
Yeah, I would say not as much as we want to at this point. So most of the people that participated in the 300 were either business owners or involved maybe in real estate development, although it may have been nonprofit community development. We also had a large contingent of social entrepreneurs, which are, I think, a little bit more ingrained in the community fabric. So we did not use like community organizing groups to help us. We pretty much did it on our own. I have worked in the mayor's office. I had a lot of relationships with different groups. I think moving forward, I mentioned the idea of growing this collaboration and convening. And so the summit concept, I think, would be where we would engage maybe some more of the grassroots or community organizers to get more people involved. But we did reach out to a fair number of what I would call more community-based groups to brief them or to try to get their members involved. But we pretty much did it on our own. We didn't engage someone to help us.
Thank you very much. It must have been a huge lift.
I'm just seeing in the chat that we had a question from Nayeli Rodriguez. And I think as the time is growing short, Nayeli, we're going to ask you to come to the next session, hopefully, because the question is about talk about more direct support approaches to small businesses and business owners. And I know that Colin is planning on having a session on that. So if we can just, if you don't mind hanging on for that, but it's great to know that there's interest in that. So that's really helpful. And I see my friend Francisco Jorge from Villanova de Vallecao just raised his hand. Francisco, would you like to ask a question?
Hello, Tricia.
Hello.
My voice is not very well. Great to see you again. It's very interesting, the project of Baltimore. As Tricia know, Famalicão also try to develop a strategic methodology to involve and engage the community in the challenges that we have. In this moment, I don't have no question. I'm studying now and consulting the site of Baltimore Together, and to study and to learn how we could transfer some ideas and some methodologies to increase and made the best planning we can in our city. Thank you, Tricia. Once again, I'm very glad to see you. Thank you.
Great, thank you. We had, it's great to see participants from the last phase who are joining and bringing their experiences as well. I saw that we had, I think it's Jamie Hurst had their hand up. Jamie? I think this will be the last question for now, but remember, we'll have Colin for future sessions. So I see there's a couple of questions in the chat, and we're going to save those questions. We look forward to having you join us again. Jamie, were you there?
Yes.
Oh.
Hello, everyone. Colin, thanks so much for your presentation today. I just have a question. Besides eliminating the red zones, could you share some of the other tangible actions that Baltimore plans to undertake to reduce economic racial disparities specifically?
Yeah, so it's twofold, and we probably don't have time to get into all the different pieces. So I think it's multifaceted. So one is investing in communities of color, and we do have a housing and community development framework plan, which identifies 7 specific what we call impact investment areas. And so we're collaborating across housing, our organization, the private sector, nonprofit sector, to gear investment in those key areas. And so there's a sort of a series of priority projects. And so hopefully that will lift up those communities. I think that's sort of the place-based strategy that I mentioned. And then there's the specific people-based strategy. So at least from an economic development standpoint, I won't get too much into workforce. That's a little outside of my lane, but in terms of economic development, we have goals here specifically to invest in founders of color. And we're doing that both directly as well as investing in other organizations. So we've made investments in 3 different organizations: Innovation Works, a program called Hutch, as well as ECAN, which is an arts program. All of those are led by people of color. Actually, the 4th one, Conscious Venture Labs. Those are all led by people of color and are investing in entrepreneurs of color. And so we support their programming. And then in addition, on the lending side, we actually we just contracted with a company called R3 Score. Teresa Hodge, who participated in the Torino visit, she has a company that is AI-based artificial intelligence that has an alternative credit score. It was initially geared towards formerly incarcerated individuals who had credit issues, but we're using it also across racial barriers. So instead of excluding people who have the traditional credit score issue and can't get a loan, we're looking at it from a much different angle. And so those are just a couple of some of the like very specific actions that we're trying to do. But basically, we're trying to increase our lending, increase our investment in entrepreneurs of color. It's pretty well known that if those folks are successful, they're much more likely to hire Black and brown employees. Again, and so it's trying to take folks that have not been able to get into what we might call the mainstream economy and create more clear pathways. So those are just a couple of the pieces I can mention, and we could go into a lot more detail at some point.
Wonderful. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Colin, for the great presentation and a great kickoff for this cluster that we have. And I'm really happy with those questions. And please, I ask the audience, you can still add your questions to the chat or the Q&A, and we're saving those. And we're, like I said, we're very fortunate to have Colin, who will be accompanying us along the way. So that will help us to tailor future sessions as well. So Colin, thank you so much. It was really, really impressive what's happening in Baltimore, and we're really interested to hear how it unfolds, and very good luck.
Thank you, Tricia. It was a pleasure to be here. There was also a question about reuse of housing of worship, and I threw a link in there. That's my favorite reuse, which also happens to be Ernst Valerie, who participated. That's his project. They turned a church into a brewery, and it's called Ministry of Brewing, and it's pretty cool. So we have fun here too.
That's very cool. I can attest that there's a lot of fun to be had in Baltimore.